Darwin is the reason why I have to teach this. All right, this is Norris Teaches Science, another biology edition in the evolution section. And I am Mr. Norris, and today we're going to talk about something called natural selection. The video goal for today is I can explain how natural selection works and how it is related to evolution. So, when we start talking about evolution and we start talking about some of the people about natural selection, two guys come in. You have Lamarck, who did something called the theory of acquired characteristics. And I have a frowny face here. That's because he was wrong, dead wrong. And then you have Charles Darwin, and he came out with his theory of natural selection. There's a smiley face there because it was better, and it's kind of like it started the whole idea of modern natural selection and modern evolutional theories. So Lamarck and his theory, how Lamarck said his theory was the theory of acquired characteristics, and it said individuals can acquire change during its lifetime and pass them on to their offspring. He was wrong. His idea is that because giraffes just kept stretching their neck got longer, and since someone finally had a long neck and then had kids, the kids had long necks. Or you say you have a bodybuilder and he's spent his whole life building and having huge muscles. Well, he'll have kids and he'll pass on those huge muscles to the baby, so the baby will have huge muscles. And you're probably looking at me like, we know that's not right. Well, yes, but back then they didn't know that. I mean, if could have a bodybuilder father and have muscles and not have to work out, that would be so cool. I mean, my mom is a toothpick, and I'm over here not a toothpick. We won't talk about that. But he was wrong. Comes Darwin and natural selection. So a little bit of background about Darwin. Darwin joined a voyage on a ship called the HMS Beagle in 1831. It was a 5-year voyage, and he was their naturalist. During this trip, they stopped at a place called the Galapagos Islands. It's this whole bunch of islands in a little archipelago. And each island had different species on it. And so he studied the animals. One of the most important ones about the idea of natural selection he focused on was the finches. He published a book with his theory and his observations in a book called On the Origin of the Species. And during this time, he developed his theory for natural selection. So, some of Darwin's Galapagos observations, he looked at the turtles or tortoises, and on different islands and in different habitats, they have different shell shapes. So, they were different turtles all from these on these islands. He had the iguanas that they were marine iguanas. Most iguanas don't go in the water, but these iguanas could go underwater and eat algae off a rock. And then the finches on different islands with different habitats, they all had different beak shapes, but they all were finches. So they were different species of finches that all lived in this island area, and they all had different beaks, making them different species. And it was one of the most talked about observations he made. So Darwin's conclusions um, was that the finches had different beak structures for different feeding habitats. So some finches ate insects, so they had more of a thin shaped beak, while if they were eating seeds, they had more stout shaped beaks. And he said that because of this, of them having to eat differently and lived on different islands, he called it speciation. It's different groups of organisms evolved independently from one another, ultimately becoming a different species. So what happened was there was this ancestral finch on the Galapagos Islands, but they started to spread across the islands. But since not all islands had the same food source, they had to develop. They had mutations happen in their DNA from the environmental pressures, so that they could eat, and the ones that could eat survived better, bred better, and passed on those beak shapes, and the ones who couldn't survive actually died out. And he actually called this something called geographic isolation. There's different types of isolations that can lead to speciations. We're going to talk about that on a different video. So Darwin suggested that natural selection was a process that caused adaptations which led to speciations. So because they had environmental pressures, because they had to eat, because they were competing, because they were trying to survive, caused new species to arise through mutations in the DNA. All this had happened in the DNA. So the theory of natural selection, 4 points to it. Organisms must show variations in trait, and they have to be inheritable. It means you have to be able to pass them on. So in giraffes, they had to be able to pass on the traits to their offspring. So we know that these have to occur in the sex chromosomes, sex cells, the gametes, so that they can be passed on. Now, what happens is in the wild, more offspring are produced that then can survive. This even happens in the human race. But if you think about it, like mice have a lot of babies, but not all the babies survive into adulthood. The offspring will compete for resources, and not all is going to survive. They're going to compete for food, shelter, all this stuff, and some of them just won't survive. You can see that over in this picture here. You have 3 giraffes. 2 giraffes can reach the food. 1 giraffe cannot, and the one that cannot, it's died out. It didn't have enough to survive, so it died out. And those who are most fit with the best adaptation survive, reproduce, and pass on their adaptations to their offspring. So the offspring have it, so they can survive better too. I usually tell my students, just remember that for natural selection to happen, you need to survive, reproduce, and make babies. That's natural selection. I use some other terms in my class, but we're not going to talk about them on these videos. That's if you're my student in class. So what is natural selection, aka the survival of the fittest? So you're thinking about fittest, you're thinking someone that can run a mile in 4 minutes, that can have huge muscles, in shape, all this stuff. Fitness doesn't mean that in natural selection. Fitness means reproduction. Someone who can reproduce and produce a lot of offspring. And so this is a mechanism of change in the population. That's what natural selection is. So when someone says most times I see people who do stupid acts on the internet, and someone will be like, natural selection at work. Well, it's kind of true, but not all the way. They're not going. If they don't survive, then no, then they are not going to be the fittest. All right, but this is a little bit about natural selection. There's a whole bunch more out there. There's a bunch of videos that you can watch. There's more information. If you want to go read the book, go buy it. I've actually going to admit I've never read Darwin's On the Origin of the Species, but I hope you learned something today. And this is Miss Norris, and he is signing out.